The check was already on the table before Ryan sat down. $1 million written in Evelyn Whitmore's steady hand, placed like a verdict. She told him the terms were simple: walk away from her daughter, disappear from their lives completely, and the money was his. Everyone in that room assumed a quiet carpenter would know better than to refuse a woman like Evelyn Whitmore. Ryan picked up the check, studied it for a long moment, then set it back down, and said the one sentence that began to unravel her. What Evelyn never knew was that the man sitting across from her could have bought her entire company and still had change left over. So who exactly was Ryan Hayes? The town didn't have a name worth remembering, which was exactly why Claire Whitmore had chosen it. It sat along the eastern bend of the Hudson River, quiet enough that no one would recognize her face from the financial press, small enough that her phone lost signal in 3 out of 4 corners of the main street. She had driven up alone on a Thursday, told her assistant she needed 48 hours, and checked into a bed and breakfast that didn't have a website. For a woman who ran a billion-dollar holding company before the age of 37, the silence felt almost illegal. She hadn't planned to stay past the weekend. But on Saturday morning, while walking along the waterfront with a coffee she'd bought from a counter staffed by a man who didn't know her name, she passed an open workshop tucked between a hardware store and a closed diner. The front door was rolled up like a garage. Inside, a man was bent over a long oak table working a hand plane across the surface in slow, deliberate strokes. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't checking anything. He was just working, the way people work when no one is watching, and they don't particularly care either way. Claire stopped without meaning to. There was something in the scene that caught her, not the man himself, not yet, but the quality of his attention. She had spent the last 6 years in rooms where everyone was performing something: confidence, indifference, authority, hunger. This man was performing nothing. He was simply there doing the thing in front of him, and the contrast was stark enough to hold her in place for a moment longer, then was polite. He noticed her eventually, looked up without surprise, and nodded once. His name was Ryan Hayes. He told her that when she asked after she'd apologized for staring, and he'd waved the apology off like it was unnecessary. He was in his mid-40s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of calm that didn't come from ease, but from having passed through something difficult and come out the other side with fewer illusions. He restored antique wood furniture, tables, cabinets, floors, frames, pieces that other people had given up on. He did it slowly and by hand, and he charged accordingly, and his waiting list was long enough that he didn't need to advertise. They talked for 20 minutes that first morning, standing at the edge of the workshop while the river moved behind the buildings and the light shifted from gray to gold. He asked her what brought her up here. She said she needed quiet. He said that was a good reason. He didn't ask what she did for a living, which was unusual, and she didn't volunteer it, which was a relief. When she left, she wasn't sure she would come back. By Sunday afternoon, she was standing in his doorway again with 2 cups of coffee and no particular excuse. That was how it started. Not with drama, not with a single decisive moment, but with the accumulation of small, ordinary exchanges that meant nothing on their own and everything together. Claire extended her stay by 3 days, then by a week. She told herself it was the river, the silence, the change in air. That was partly true. But it was also Ryan, the steadiness of him, the way he moved through a conversation without trying to win it. The fact that he never once asked her what she was worth or who she knew. In a life built around people who wanted something from her, he was the first person in a long time who seemed to want nothing at all. By the time she returned to New York, something had shifted in her that she couldn't fully name. She began making trips back to the town, once every 2 weeks, then once a week. Ryan didn't ask her to. He didn't push toward anything. He was simply there when she arrived, and that consistency, quiet, undemanding, real, was more than most of the relationships in her life had ever offered. She started keeping a spare jacket at his house. He started making coffee before she knocked, Neither of them commented on either of those things, which said everything. What Evelyn Whitmore knew about Ryan Hayes, she had gathered through a private investigator within 72 hours of Claire mentioning his name. The report was thorough. Ryan Marcus Hayes, age 44, owner of a sole proprietor furniture restoration business, operating out of a rented workshop in a river town 2 hours north of the city. No corporate affiliations on record, no investment portfolio flagged under his name. A modest house, a used truck, and a business that generated a comfortable but unremarkable income by any standard Evelyn recognized. He had a background in finance, she noted that briefly, but the trail went cold more than a decade back, and her investigator found nothing beyond a few dissolved LLCs and a series of wire transfers that had apparently been liquidated and moved into private accounts, whose details were not publicly traceable. She filed that detail away without giving it sufficient weight. That would prove to be her most consequential mistake. Evelyn didn't operate from cruelty. She would have rejected that word entirely. She operated from a set of beliefs she had held for so long that she had stopped examining them. Beliefs about what kind of life was acceptable, what kind of man was suitable, what the Whitmore name required of the people attached to it. She had built the holding company alongside her late husband, and had steered it through 3 recessions and 2 hostile acquisition attempts. She knew what it meant to fight for something, and she was not about to watch her daughter, the CEO she had groomed and positioned and protected, attach herself to a man who sanded furniture in a river town and didn't own a suit jacket she could verify. The first time Evelyn met Ryan was at a dinner party held at the Whitmore Brownstone in the West Village, a gathering of investors, board members, and the kind of people who circulate through every important room in New York, without anyone quite remembering when they first appeared. Claire had brought Ryan with a quietness that Evelyn recognized as deliberate. She was not announcing him. She was simply including him, which in some ways was worse. It suggested she had already decided he belonged there. Ryan arrived in dark slacks and a clean button-down. He shook hands when introduced, said little when not directly spoken to, and observed the room with an attention that Evelyn might have called calculating if she'd been paying closer attention to his eyes. She wasn't. She was too busy cataloging everything she considered insufficient, the absence of a tailored jacket, the way he held his glass, without the slight self-consciousness that people new to wealth always carry, the fact that he didn't name-drop once across an entire evening, when name-dropping was essentially the ambient language of everyone else in the room. One of Evelyn's board members, a man named Douglas Farr, had drifted toward Ryan at some point in the evening and attempted the usual currency exchange: schools, neighborhoods, firms. Ryan had answered each question briefly and without elaboration. Douglas had returned to Evelyn's side and said with the particular amusement of a man who considered himself perceptive that her daughter's companion was either very private or had very little to say. Evelyn had smiled and said nothing. She had already made her assessment. Later that night, after the guests had gone and Claire was helping the catering staff gather glasses, Evelyn found Ryan standing near the bookshelf in the front room, looking at a framed photograph from the 1980s. Evelyn and her husband Young standing in front of the original Whitmore office building on their first day of operation. Ryan didn't know she was behind him. He was looking at the photograph the way he looked at old wood, with a kind of careful interest, reading something in it that wasn't immediately visible. Evelyn watched him for a moment, then announced herself with the click of her heels on the hardwood. Ryan turned, and there was nothing caught or guilty in his expression. He simply looked at her, the way he had looked at her all evening, attentive, measured, entirely composed. "It was a good building," he said, nodding toward the photograph. "It was," Evelyn said. "We sold it in 2004. Ryan nodded slowly, like that meant something. Then Claire appeared in the doorway, and whatever the moment had been, it closed. Evelyn acted within the week. She didn't consult Claire. She didn't announce herself. She had Ryan's number from the investigator's report, and she called it from her personal line on a Tuesday morning, and she told him she would like to meet. She said she believed in directness. Ryan said that was fine and named a time. The meeting took place at Evelyn's private residence, not the brownstone, but the house in Greenwich, which she used for conversations she didn't want witnessed. It was a deliberate choice, the kind of environmental signal that Evelyn had deployed her entire career to establish who held the power in a room before a word was spoken. The house was immaculate and enormous, and filled with the kind of furniture that cost more than most people's annual salaries. She had coffee prepared but did not offer any when Ryan arrived. He came in, sat down across from her without surveying the room, and waited for her to speak. That was the first thing that unsettled her. He didn't look around. People always looked around in that house. Evelyn laid it out cleanly. She told him that Claire was at a critical point in both her career and the company's trajectory, that the pressures on her were significant, and that a relationship with someone outside their world introduced complications that Evelyn was not willing to accept on her daughter's behalf. She told him she respected his time and his privacy. Then she placed the check on the table between them. $1 million. She had written it herself that morning by hand, in her office. She told him the terms. He left Claire completely and permanently, with no contact, and no explanation owed to anyone. In return, the money was his clean, untaxed, through any mechanism she could arrange, and delivered within 48 hours of his compliance. She said all of this in the tone she used in boardrooms, measured and final, leaving no visible seam for negotiation. Ryan looked at the check for a long time. Not the way people look at large sums of money, with the slight widening of focus, the involuntary recalibration of the body, but the way he had looked at that photograph in her front room, carefully, reading something in it. Then he picked up the check, folded it once, and slid it into the inside pocket of his jacket. He stood, straightened his collar, and walked to the door without a word. He didn't cash it. He didn't agree to anything. He simply took it with him and left, and the door clicked shut behind him with a quietness that landed in the room like a weight. Evelyn sat with that silence for a long moment. Her first interpretation was that he was calculating that a man in his position would take time to think, would return, with a counteroffer, would eventually find a number that worked, and that by taking the check, he had at least signaled he was open to the conversation. She had seen that before. She knew how to wait. What she did not consider, sitting in that enormous room in Greenwich with the Hudson just visible through the far window, was the possibility that Ryan Hayes had taken the check, not as acceptance, but as evidence, something to keep something, that told a true story about who had been in that room and what they had believed about him. That thought didn't occur to her. Not yet. What she felt instead as she rose and called her assistant was a slow consolidation of contempt, the particular contempt of someone who believes another person is playing a long game they don't yet understand. She would give him time, and then she would close it. She never once questioned whether the power in that room had been hers. In the weeks that followed the meeting in Greenwich, Claire felt something change without being able to name what it was. Ryan was still there. He answered her calls. He was present when she visited the town, but there was a new quality to his distance, something careful and self-contained that hadn't been there before. He didn't pull away dramatically. He didn't invent reasons to cut conversations short. It was subtler than that, the way a door can be open and still feel closed, and Claire was perceptive enough to feel it without being able to name the cause. She told herself it was the natural rhythm of two people living very different lives in very different places. She told herself that she was reading into things because the pressure at home had made her hypersensitive to loss. Both of those explanations were partially true, and neither of them was the real reason. What Claire didn't know was that Ryan had begun quietly and deliberately to create space between them, not because he wanted to leave, but because he had watched what that dinner party had cost her, had understood what Evelyn's private meeting signaled about what was coming, and had decided in his characteristic way that the most honest thing he could do was stop pulling Claire toward a conflict she hadn't chosen. He didn't tell her about the check. He didn't tell her about the meeting in Greenwich. He made that choice the same way he made most of his choices, without announcement, without drama, carrying the weight of it alone, and saying nothing. He kept the check in the inside pocket of the same jacket he'd worn to Greenwich, folded once untouched, not as a prize, and not as a wound, but as a fact. A record of what had happened in that room, and what it had revealed about the people in it. Evelyn moved with the confidence of someone who believed the first offer had simply been insufficient. Within the month following her meeting with Ryan, she had arranged 3 separate introductions for Claire, a corporate attorney from a family she had known for 20 years, a real estate developer whose firm had partnered with Whitmore Holdings on 2 projects, and a private equity partner, whom Evelyn described with characteristic economy as serious and suitable. She framed each introduction as coincidence, as a natural overlap of professional circles, because she knew Claire well enough to know that a direct campaign would produce direct resistance. Claire attended the first dinner, understood immediately what it was, and said very little on the drive home. She attended the second event out of exhaustion rather than compliance, and she did not attend the third. What she did instead was call Ryan from the parking garage of the building where the third event was being held, standing between 2 cars in the dim light, telling him she was tired in a way she couldn't fully explain. Ryan listened without offering solutions. He asked her what she needed. She said she didn't know. He said that was okay. They stayed on the phone for 40 minutes without resolving anything, and somehow that was more comfort than anything else had offered her in weeks. But comfort wasn't the same as clarity, and in the absence of clarity, the distance between them continued to grow slowly, without hostility, like 2 points on a map drifting apart. Not because either one is moving quickly, but because neither one is holding still. Claire felt it and didn't push. Ryan felt it and didn't close it, and the space between them filled up with everything neither of them was saying. The crisis at Whitmore Holdings did not announce itself. It arrived the way most financial crises arrive for companies that believe their size protects them through a sequence of decisions that each seemed defensible in isolation and became catastrophic in combination. A major acquisition in the logistics sector, approved by the board 11 months earlier, had been built on projections that assumed stable freight costs and a regulatory environment that shifted 6 weeks after the deal closed. The losses began quietly, then accelerated. By the time the quarterly numbers were fully reconciled, Whitmore Holdings was carrying a debt position that made its major lenders nervous and its equity partners cautious. Claire had flagged concerns about the acquisition at the board level twice in the months before it closed. The minutes reflected her objections. That fact would matter later, but it didn't matter now because the company was in crisis, regardless of who had been right, and the immediate problem was capital, specifically the absence of a partner willing to commit the kind of investment necessary to stabilize the company's position before the next lending review. Evelyn had spent 30 years building relationships in New York's financial community, and she activated all of them in the weeks that followed. Most conversations ended the same way, with sympathy, with genuine regard for the Whitmore name, and with a polite decline. The company's exposure was too significant, the restructuring too uncertain, the timeline too compressed. One by one, the doors that Evelyn had believed were permanently open to her turned out to be open only in favorable weather. She made 12 calls in 8 days. 11 of them went nowhere. The 12th she had been avoiding. There was one name left on her list. Her investigator had surfaced the connection weeks earlier in a follow-up report she had commissioned out of habit rather than urgency. Hayes Global Capital, a private investment group mid-sized by the standards of the top-tier firms, but exceptionally liquid, with a reputation for moving quickly on distressed opportunities when the underlying asset quality was sound. The group had no public profile. Its chairman gave no interviews, made no appearances at the conferences where Evelyn's World conducted its social business. The name on the filing documents was listed simply as I.R. Hayes. Evelyn had read that name and set the report down, and not returned to it for 3 days. When she finally did, she read it again more carefully, and then she sat in her office for a long time without calling anyone. She thought about the man who had sat across from her in Greenwich without looking around the room. She thought about the check she had placed on that table, and the particular way he had picked it up, not with relief, not with calculation, but with the steady hands of someone making a record of something. She had read that gesture wrong at the time. She was beginning to wonder what else she had read wrong. The meeting request went through Hayes Global Capital's legal office formal, and precisely worded the way Evelyn did everything when she needed to perform composure. The response came within 24 hours, a confirmation, a conference room address in Midtown, a time. No personal message. No name attached to the reply beyond the firm's letterhead. Evelyn prepared for that meeting, the way she had prepared for every significant meeting of her career, with research, with positioning, with a clear sense of what she intended to say, and what she intended to yield, and where her floor was. She brought her CFO and her general counsel. She wore the charcoal suit she wore when she needed to project authority without appearing to try. She arrived 4 minutes early, which was her standard, early enough to claim the room, not so early as to appear anxious. The conference room was clean and spare, with a long table and floor-to-ceiling windows looking north across the city. There were 4 people already seated on the other side of the table. Evelyn took her chair, opened her folder, and looked up at the head of the table. Ryan Hayes was standing at the window, with his back to the room, looking out at the city. When he turned, it was with the same quality of motion she remembered from her own house, unhurried, unperforming. He was in a dark suit, now, well cut, and it changed nothing about the fundamental impression he gave, which was of a man entirely comfortable with exactly where he stood. He looked at Evelyn across the table and said good morning, in the same tone he had used that evening in her front room. Looking at the photograph on her wall, Evelyn's CFO said something. She didn't register what it was. The general counsel shifted in his chair. Evelyn kept her face composed by an act of will that cost her more than anything in that room would ever know. Ryan sat down at the head of the table, placed one hand flat on the surface, and said he had reviewed the Whitmore Holdings position and found the underlying assets more solid than the current distress suggested. He said his firm was prepared to discuss terms. His tone was professional and without edge, and that absence of edge was its own kind of statement. He was not going to use this moment to embarrass her. He was going to conduct business, which was almost worse, because it meant she had to sit across from him and do the same. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Evelyn answered questions from Ryan's team with the precision she was known for, and she watched from some removed part of herself as the man she had tried to pay $1 million to disappear from her daughter's life conducted the most consequential financial negotiation of her career with a competence that was impossible to dismiss. He knew the logistics sector. He knew her company's debt structure in more detail than she had expected. He asked questions that revealed without comment that he had been studying Whitmore Holdings for some time, not just in the weeks since her meeting request, but before. How long before she didn't ask? She didn't want the answer. When the session concluded and Ryan's team began gathering their documents, Evelyn stood and extended her hand across the table, the way she always did, firm, direct, final. Ryan shook it. His grip was the same as it had been the first time they met at her dinner party when she had categorized him as insufficient. She thought about that categorization now and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The room was full of people, and she had a company to save, and everything else would have to wait. What broke Claire open was not the discovery itself, but the order in which she learned things. She found out about Ryan's position at Hayes Global Capital the way most people find out about the true scale of what they've been living beside. Not through a direct conversation, but through a third party who assumed she already knew. A colleague of hers, a woman named Sandra, who ran investor relations for a firm 2 floors above Whitmore Holdings, in the same building, mentioned over lunch that she'd heard Hayes Global was in talks with Claire's company, and added with genuine curiosity that Claire must know the chairman personally given. She let the sentence trail off with the particular delicacy of someone who realizes mid-sentence they may have said too much. Claire went back to her office and closed the door. She sat at her desk and looked at nothing for a long time. Then she opened her laptop and pulled the public filing records for Hayes Global Capital, and she read them carefully, and when she was done, she understood what she was looking at. She understood the scale of it. She understood that Ryan had known from their very first conversation at the edge of that workshop exactly who he was, and exactly what he had, and he had never once mentioned any of it, not to impress her, not to reassure her, not to counteract the condescension he had absorbed at her family's dinner table without a word of complaint. She thought about all the evenings she had spent worrying about what her mother thought. She thought about the careful distance Ryan had been creating between them, and understood it now in a new way. Not as self-protection, but as a kind of consideration for her misguided maybe, but rooted in something real. He had been trying to keep her out of the middle of something she hadn't asked to be in. He had said nothing about the Greenwich meeting. He had said nothing about the check. He had carried all of it alone and let her interpret his distance as insecurity, and she had believed that interpretation because it was easier than the alternative. The alternative was that she had been protected without her knowledge or consent by a man she had been underestimating in the wrong direction entirely. Not because he had less than she thought, because he had more patience, more restraint, more genuine indifference to the performance of wealth than anyone she had ever encountered in the world she'd grown up in. She closed the laptop. She didn't call Ryan, not yet. She needed to sit with what she now knew about her mother first, with the image of that check written out by hand in Evelyn's office, placed on a table in Greenwich, like a property transfer, like Ryan Hayes was a problem with a price tag. She needed to sit with the fact that her mother had done that, and said nothing to her, that Ryan had taken it, and said nothing to her either, that she had been the last person in her own life to know what was happening around her. That was the thing that stayed with her longest. Not the money, not the revelation of Ryan's identity, but the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people making decisions on her behalf, in her name, about her future, and trusting her with none of it. She had spent her whole career fighting for the authority to run her own company, and somehow, in the part of her life that mattered more than any boardroom, she had still ended up on the outside of every room where the real decisions were made. The second meeting between Evelyn and Ryan's team was scheduled for a Thursday. It was the session that would determine whether Hayes Global Capital would move forward with a formal term sheet. The difference between Whitmore Holdings surviving the next lending review and not surviving it. Evelyn had spent the intervening days doing what she always did under pressure working. She reviewed every document her team prepared, corrected 3 errors in the financial projections, and rewrote the executive summary herself because the version her CFO produced used language she considered imprecise. She did all of this with the discipline of someone who has learned to treat motion as a substitute for feeling. What she did not do was call Claire. She told herself it was because Claire had enough to manage that the CEO's attention needed to stay on operations rather than on the capital negotiations, that this was Evelyn's arena, and she was handling it. All of that was true in a narrow way, but the fuller truth, which Evelyn could not quite bring herself to examine directly, was that she didn't know what she would say. She had built her entire relationship with her daughter on the premise that she knew better what the company needed, better what Claire needed better, what kind of life was worth living, and what kind of man was worth loving. That premise was no longer available to her in the same form, and without it, she didn't know how to begin a conversation. So she worked instead, and she prepared, and she arrived at the Midtown conference room on Thursday morning 8 minutes early, and sat in the same chair she had occupied the first time, and waited. Ryan came in with 2 members of his team. He set a folder on the table, sat down, and looked across at Evelyn with an expression that gave nothing away, and withheld nothing either. It was simply direct, the way his face had always been direct. and Evelyn found it harder to hold his gaze now than she had the first time. The first time she had been certain of her position. That certainty was gone, and in its absence, looking at him was like looking at evidence. The session began with Ryan's associate presenting a revised summary of Hayes Global's proposed terms. The investment figure was significant, large enough to fully stabilize Whitmore Holdings' debt position and provide 18 months of operational runway, while the logistics acquisition was restructured. The conditions were specific: a board restructuring, a revised executive oversight framework, and a clause that gave Hayes Global approval rights over any acquisition above a defined threshold for a period of 4 years. All of it was reasonable. All of it was by any objective measure more generous than the market situation warranted. Evelyn's general counsel leaned over and said quietly that the terms were favorable. Evelyn nodded without looking at him. She was reading the clause about board restructuring, which required the removal of any board member with a material conflict of interest as determined by an independent review. She read it twice. Then she set the document down and looked at Ryan, and she asked him directly whether the independent review had a predetermined outcome. Ryan looked back at her without any satisfaction in his expression. He said the review would be conducted by a third-party firm his team had used on 4 previous transactions, that the process was standard and documented, and that the outcome would depend entirely on what the review found. He said this evenly without emphasis, and Evelyn understood that he was telling her the truth, that he was not engineering her removal, that he was simply building a clean structure, and that if the review found what any honest review would find, the outcome would follow from that. She picked up her pen and made a note in the margin of the document. Her hand was steady. She had made sure of that. The formal break came 90 minutes into the session, and most of the people in the room moved toward the side table where coffee had been set out. Ryan stayed at the table. So did Evelyn. When the room had thinned enough, she closed the folder in front of her and looked at him across the empty distance between their chairs. She had prepared nothing for this moment. That was unusual for her, and she was aware of it. Everything she had said in this room, and in every room like it for 30 years, had been prepared, structured, sequenced, designed to produce a specific effect. She had no structure for this. She had only what was true, and what was true was that she had placed a check for $1 million on a table in her house in Greenwich, and asked this man to disappear from her daughter's life, and he had looked at it, the way you look at something that tells you exactly who you're dealing with, picked it up, pocketed it, and walked out. She had interpreted that as leverage, when it was actually something else entirely. It had been documentation. He had kept it because it was true, and truth was the only currency he had ever traded in. Evelyn said his name. He looked at her. She told him she owed him an apology. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without softening the edges, but the content of it was unfamiliar in her own mouth, and she could hear that. She told him that she had treated him as a problem to be managed, and that she had been wrong, not only because of what she now knew about his position, but because it had been wrong before she knew any of that. She said that the check had been an insult, and that she had intended it as one, and that she understood now what it had cost. Not Ryan, who had walked away from that table without apparent difficulty, but Claire, who had been living inside a version of events her own mother had carefully withheld from her. Ryan listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding something rather than struggling with something. Then he said that he appreciated her saying it. He said it simply, without irony, and Evelyn understood that he meant it, that he was not going to use this moment to extract anything further, that the apology had been received, and that was where it ended. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed something on the table between them. It was the check, folded once exactly as he had folded it in her house in Greenwich on the afternoon he took it. Evelyn recognized it before she fully processed what she was seeing, because she had written it herself, by hand, in her own office. The ink was still as clean as the morning she had signed it. $1 million made out to Ryan Marcus Hayes never cashed, carried in a jacket pocket across all the months since that afternoon. Not as a threat, not as a bargaining chip, but as a record. Ryan said, I kept it as a reminder of what I didn't need. Then he picked up his coffee, stood and returned to his seat at the head of the table as the rest of the room filtered back in and the meeting resumed. Evelyn left the check on the table in front of her for the remainder of the session. She didn't touch it again. When the meeting ended and she gathered her documents, she folded it once more and put it in her bag, and she took it with her because it belonged to her now in a different way than it had when she wrote it. It was no longer an instrument. It was a mirror. And she was not yet done looking at what it showed her. Claire and Ryan's conversation happened not in New York, but in the river town on the small covered porch outside his workshop 2 days after the Thursday meeting. Claire had driven up without calling ahead, which was something she had never done before, and Ryan had come to the workshop door when he heard the car in the gravel and had not seemed surprised to see her, which was something she had come to understand about him, that he was rarely surprised by things that made sense. She told him that she knew about Greenwich. She told him she knew about the check. She said this without anger, or rather, she said it with the anger already spent, because she had done most of that alone in her apartment, in the days between learning the truth and driving up here, and what was left now was something quieter and harder to name. Ryan sat down on the porch step and looked at the gravel. He didn't try to explain the sequence of events in a way that repositioned his choices as something other than what they had been. He said he had been wrong not to tell her. He said he had thought he was protecting her from a conflict she hadn't chosen, and that he understood now that making that decision for her was its own kind of wrong, a better-intentioned wrong than her mother's maybe, but still a wrong. Claire sat down beside him. She asked him why he hadn't just told her the first time they met who he was, what he had. Ryan said he hadn't told anyone in that town that he had left the financial world more than a decade ago, specifically because he had wanted to be somewhere that none of that defined him, and that when he'd met her, telling her would have changed what the thing between them was before it had a chance to be anything. He said that by the time it mattered, he didn't know how to introduce it without it sounding like a correction to something she'd never actually believed. Claire listened to all of this and was quiet for a while. Then she said she understood it, even if she didn't entirely forgive the outcome of it. Ryan said that was fair. They stayed on that porch for a long time, without resolving everything, because not everything was resolvable in one afternoon, and both of them knew that. But something that had been closed began to open again, carefully, the way you open something old that you don't want to break. The terms of Hayes Global's investment in Whitmore Holdings were finalized 3 weeks later. The independent review was conducted and concluded within its stated timeline. The board restructuring followed. Evelyn Whitmore resigned from the board of directors on a Tuesday morning in a letter she wrote herself without being asked to revise it. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged the finding of the review. The second expressed confidence in Claire's leadership. The third contained no self-pity and no justification, which cost Evelyn more than the resignation itself. Claire assumed full operational and strategic authority over the company for the first time since she had taken the CEO title. The difference was not visible to anyone outside the boardroom, but inside it everyone felt it, the absence of a counterweight of a set of older eyes reading every decision for alignment with a vision that had been formed in a different era. Claire made 3 strategic decisions in her first month of uncontested authority that her mother would not have approved, and all 3 were correct, and she knew they were correct before she made them, which was the difference. Evelyn moved through the months that followed with the particular discipline of someone recalibrating in private. She did not disappear. She attended the functions she had always attended, maintained the relationships she had always maintained, and continued to be a formidable presence in the rooms she entered. But she was quieter in those rooms than she had been, and people who had known her for years noticed it without knowing what had produced it. She did not explain herself to any of them. She was not at her core someone who explained herself, But she was, for the first time in a long time, someone who doubted herself. Not in the corrosive way, not in the way that stops a person from moving, but in the way that makes a person look twice before they speak. That was new. It was uncomfortable. She accepted it as the cost of having been wrong in a way that mattered. There was one other thing she did 3 months after her resignation that she told no one about. She drove up to the river town on a Wednesday morning alone without calling ahead. She found the workshop by following the sound of the hand plane across wood, the same way Claire had found it the first time. Ryan saw her car through the open door and came out to meet her. They stood in the gravel for a few minutes, and Evelyn said what she had come to say, not about the company, not about the terms, not about anything that could be resolved with a document. She said she had spent a long time believing that the people who built things quietly were waiting for an opportunity to be seen. She said she understood now that some of them simply didn't need to be. Ryan listened. He nodded once. He didn't tell her it was fine because it wasn't entirely fine, and they both knew that. But he shook her hand when she left, and she drove back to the city with the windows down, which was something she had not done in years. By spring, Claire had stopped keeping her life in 2 separate containers. She no longer maintained the fiction that the river town was a retreat, a pressure valve, something she returned to and then left. She began spending 4 days a week there, driving into the city for what required her physical presence, and handling everything else remotely, because she had built a company capable of functioning without her standing in its center every hour of every day, and it was time she let it prove that. Ryan's workshop was 50 feet from the house. She could hear the sound of him working in the mornings from the kitchen table where she took her calls. It was a steady sound, the plane across the wood, the occasional knock of a mallet, the silence that meant he was looking at something carefully before deciding what to do with it. She had stopped finding the sound distracting. She had started finding it necessary, the way certain sounds become part of the structure of a life without your noticing exactly when that happened. The river was visible from the end of the road. In spring, it ran high and fast, and the color of iron. And in the mornings, before the work of the day started, Claire sometimes walked to the end of the road and stood at the water's edge for a few minutes. She didn't think about the company in those minutes, or about her mother, or about the version of her life she had been living when she first drove up here, looking for quiet. She didn't believe she'd actually find. She thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of answer to the question she had been carrying for years without knowing she was carrying it. In the top drawer of Ryan's desk, underneath a folded survey map of the county and a brass compass that had belonged to someone he didn't talk about, the check was still there. $1 million made out in Evelyn Whitmore's hand, creased once from the fold. He had moved it from his jacket pocket to that drawer on the day he came home from the Thursday meeting after he had placed it on the conference table and watched Evelyn look at it and understand finally what it had always been. It wasn't a trophy. It wasn't a warning. It was simply an object that told the truth about a moment, about what one person had believed value looked like, and about what another person had known it wasn't. He didn't need to take it out to remember what it meant. He already knew. And on most mornings, when the light came through the workshop window, and the river was running, and Claire was at the kitchen table, and the day was asking nothing of him, yet the knowing was enough.